I will begin now.
What's going on here? Computer's having a bit of a spastic, sorry. Yes, you're okay, that's okay. Right, here we go. So, thanks very much for having me. It's great to be here. I actually am in Bondi. I'm not calling in from London. So just come back, and I guess my intention for this session is to share lots of stuff that I've learned and kind of the big effect it's had on me. I didn't realize in my career, but when you look at it, also I guess a bit of inspiration of you don't kind of have to be in the cities where this stuff's happening to kind of engage and meet people. I mean, Tina and I actually met in San Francisco at a conference, and we've kind of kept in contact. I think I probably get somebody reach out to me on LinkedIn every week relating to do something to do with speculative futures, and everywhere from Iran to the States to Asia. So, you know, I think it's very much about kind of down to you to drive that, and I kind of want to hopefully inspire you guys to do that. And I actually do think speculative futures kind of saved my life a little bit, and I'll explain why. I think I hate doing these things, but I'll try and do it quickly. I've kind of come to the fruition that everybody's supposed to have a purpose or something that drives them. So I pretty much figured out I'm quite good at helping creativity succeed. I'm not an actual designer. I have no hardcore skills, but I call myself a strategic designer. So I tend to know the value of it. The joke that I give is that my mother was creative and my dad was a businessman. So I've been trying to translate since I was about 8 years old between the two. And what I've recently done is look to kind of structure my life in the three horizons, if you will. So I think today is very much about, I work in kind of service design or product design, or I work with organizations to kind of create new things, relatively new. Tomorrow tends to be about ventures. So I tend to work in startups. So I've worked in them, I've invested in them, and I've helped build them for kind of corporates. And then alternative futures is kind of my side hustle, side project, whatever you want to call. It's just something I've been researching and interested in for about 7, 8 years. And I think each of those areas is I try to learn from and gain from every day. And one kind of pretty much feeds into the other. And sometimes I get paid for it, sometimes I don't. It just depends on kind of what I'm interested in and how I do that. That's actually a shop around the corner from where I was living in London, and just thought it was amusing at the time. I'm sorry, I'll probably give quite a lot of bad cultural references throughout. It's a bad trick of mine. But I guess I get really a bit of a stickler about what different things are. So I'm personally interested in speculative design. Speculative Futures, the group, looks across all different types and it is quite broad. I guess whenever I'm speaking to people, I like to talk more about speculative design because I think it's the most exciting and kind of slightly different in its context and what it means. I guess the main thing for me is when people ask me, it is the difference between solutions. So design thinking or design futures tend to look at solutions, where speculative design is about kind of asking questions and provoking response. So this is a bit of a summary I did about 10 minutes before a meetup last year. But I think it kind of gives you a bit of an idea of what the differences are. And the examples across the top are kind of Uber. So in terms of, okay, there's a need there at the moment, we need a solution, it kind of makes sense. The second one is actually, it was a prototype built in China where it's actually a mobile convenience store. So, you know, actually probably not a bad idea right now. I actually did this about a year ago, but it's a convenience store that rolls around a neighborhood, and it's got the basics in there, and you can literally just walk pretty much out your door straight into the convenience store and go home. So that's, you know, potentially an emerging need, especially at the moment. But it looks at pretty much similar style of the way it works for the design. And I'm sure a lot of people on here are designers, and I'm preaching to the converted. But forecasting for me tends to be about linear. So we're kind of doing this already. Let's just keep doing that. And if we keep doing that, then it'll probably amount to this. And there's a lot of talk here around kind of automation around cars and how we're going to live in that. And then the final one in speculative design is actually a film with Bruce Willis in it. I think it was about 2006, 2007. And it's the concept of you never leave your home. And you actually have a body that goes out into the world and lives your life for you, but you actually never leave your home. And I think there's elements of a lot of very relevant signals at the moment in this, but it's more about narrative and it's more about artifacts. And for me, it's more about asking the question, is this crazy and why? So the summary for me of speculative design is this idea of an imaginative leap. It needs to be kind of a bit crazy. I think the linear steps is kind of taken care for in other styles. But for me, it's about provoking discussion about kind of what matters to us and how that works in reality. So that's kind of my view on it. And it is pretty much just my view. I've stolen from others in some places. So I think we've been running the event now for 2 years, I think, 2 years in October. Upsettingly, we were supposed to run Primer this month in the UK, which we're really excited about. And so we've run around 8 events now. We probably get around 60 to 80 people at the live events. And we've actually got people approaching us now, which is great. We're doing kind of less of the hard work. And I guess our aim, some of the chapters are really interested in workshops and practice and how do we do it and all that sort of stuff. I don't really believe in that. I think it's got to be really experimental. And what I'm more interested in is getting breadth, going beyond designers, getting more people in more industries who are probably already doing this, but don't really know why. So a lot of what we try to do in London is breadth. Like, how do we get into science? How do we get doctors? How do we get, I don't know, all sorts of, someone told me about one of the Fines brothers is a farmer, and he's got this whole interesting thing around permaculture and around his view of the future. So we're very much trying to look at breadth in the UK. And for me, it's about inspiration in that breadth and how we do that. So I kind of will talk about it in the context of how it came through in my life, because I think one of the things that we found when we had lots of people talk is the projects are great, but what we want to know is what drives them. And I guess me is about kind of creativity and people. I'm really interested in how we affect people and change and things like that. And a lot of the speakers we had something that really drove them, because it's quite a difficult thing to work in or do projects in. So I think that story was kind of something we wanted to push through. I didn't know this at the time, but about 12 years ago, I went to an amazing exhibition called Design and the Elastic Mind at MoMA in New York. And Paolo Antonelli is the curator of MoMA and a bit of a lover of the Brits, I won't lie. What I didn't realize was that around 60% of the exhibition was actually British artists or British designers who I would meet later in my life. But at the time, I was just like, this stuff is weird. So, you know, the one in the right corner was my favorite, which was in essence, how do you connect more closely with your loved one or your partner? Well, what happens if you kind of, you know, put the pheromones at an extreme acceleration in terms of when you're trying to connect with them, and what would that look like? And the thing that I found really interesting was there was these really broad concepts, but it was being made into something that was kind of accessible to more people. The one on the left is what happens when we start to have to make our meat as opposed to grow it, and what could be ways to visualize that and kind of use it in another format in which would be kind of palatable, I guess. So lots of different things there. It was that long ago that I can't remember them all, but it had a huge impact on me. I'm like, oh my God, these people are just taking such interesting concepts, but they're making things. And then, you know, I could really kind of found it kind of weird, but accessible at the same time. You all know Black Mirror, no doubt. And I was actually working in advertising in the beginning, and I actually worked on the launch of Black Mirror for Channel 4, which is Channel 4's pretty much like Channel 10, but a bit more extreme. They do quite a lot of really extreme programs. And Charlie Brooker is a very renowned comedian in the UK, but also a great writer. So he actually wrote a program called Dead Set, which was about Big Brother at the time. And the Big Brother people come out of the house and realize they're in a zombie apocalypse. And so it was quite funny, but actually it happened to the German Big Brother recently. I think they kind of, they were unsure whether to tell them there was a pandemic going on or not. So what originally I read what was called a scamp, which is like a basic script of what's going on. And I didn't know what it was. I just kind of read it. And I went, oh my God, he's going to have sex with a pig on television. And this, what we didn't realize at the time, but it later came out about 5 or 6 years later, was it was renowned that Eton, when you go to Eton, there is a society or a special club that a lot of the prime ministers go to, that as a part of being in this club, you had to pretty much have sex with the head of a pig. So actually it was real, supposedly, and supposedly Charlie Brooker knew this. And so a lot of the storylines that you had in those early things, what they do really well is they take something that kind of exists, you tend to call it a signal, and they make it extreme. They just take it to its utmost extreme, which I think is a great technique in this style, which is, we kind of know this, it's kind of a small thing, but what happens if it pushed into its extreme? And I think that's provoked a lot of conversation around a lot of the things in there, which was great. And I was at the time a little bit like, bored of advertising, want to do something else. You know, what am I going to do about that? So I went back to university. I went to design school finally, and did a master's in innovation. And as a part of my master's, I invested in a startup and met this amazing couple who were just really creative and just kind of on another level. I just couldn't even begin to explain to you what that experience was like. But what I did get to do was go and work for this amazing studio for a little bit. The cool thing about this studio was there was a mix of artists, designers, engineers, and some people who were all three, and a bunch of other stuff as well. So it was very much in a workshop format. We would make things. So I really struggled in the beginning because I'd spent my life in PowerPoint presentations, and everybody just made things with their hands. And so a lot of it was around, you're not really explaining it to me. I had to learn how to kind of sketch it or draw it and things like this. So we made robots, that's kind of my arm in the bottom there, where we tried to make a musical instrument with your skin. The one on the right is a massive human mouse trap that we tried to turn into a musical instrument for a big installation we did in Africa. And so what really taught me here was this ability to conceptualize something and then physically make it, and then either as an installation or a show or whatever else. And just the different types of people that were there, and they're really lovely people as well, and just connected. So this was kind of where I started to learn about speculative design, namely through a few of the people that I worked with, which kind of really blew me away. And the first one is Katrin Baumgarten, who's a German, I don't even know, artist, designer, engineer. She's literally all of them put together. And I remember the first time I kind of met Katrin, and she was just out of RCA, which is a design university where I guess speculative design kind of was popularized, I would say is the term. And she kind of said to me, I want to apply for a grant to do an installation, like an art piece. And the concept was around what happens if smart robots revolt. And pretty much the idea was, what happens if smart robots unionize and come together against people for kind of bad treatment. And the reason why she kind of evolved it from this project she worked on in RCA around what she called the aesthetics of disgust. So the fact that design is always about beauty and, it's beautiful. And she's like, what happens when the objects start to react back? So the first one is actually, you could just feel the goosebumps, like as you touch the screen. And she was kind of obsessed with light switches. So she had quite a lot of different light switches that would either, almost have goosebumps or your hair kind of prickle up, or, a little bit of ooze might come out of it, or it might different react. So she just kind of had all these really interesting interactions and how they react. And it really started to teach me a lot around, at the time, interaction design was very digital. And I was like, it's about this, screens and pixels and stuff. Where what she was about was that physical interaction and what that tiny thing meant, and how that could you know, hugely affect the person. And worked on lots of different installations and things together with her, one I'll explain in a second. But the main thing that got me at the time was I didn't actually work with Kobe, and I only just recently had him. When did we have him? I think back in February, we had him from Canada to do a talk. But here's the Elvis mouse, which got me going at the time. Oh. So the key with this is actually, it was conceptual. And what he went on to do was to build a huge mouse house, which was almost looked like the interior of Graceland, and then would create behavioral mechanisms throughout the mouse house to kind of change this mouse. But in short, what he identified was that if he pretty much found supposedly one of Elvis's hair follicles on eBay. So he bought it. And then he found a company that could, in essence, extract the DNA sequence from that hair follicle. And then another one that you could embed it into a mouse and help potentially grow elements of that person. So at the time, this was hugely conceptual. But what he was trying to be critical about and question was, this is possible. You know, we could do this. All I'm saying is that these things are possible to us at the moment. What does that mean? And actually, as you saw in the beginning of the video, he actually got a lot of pushback. There's a joke in the UK about if you get in the Daily Mail, you know you're in trouble. But he had people calling him around, you know, pretty much death threats, and it's like, you're trying to DNA control us and stuff. And all it was an installation and a concept around that. And I loved it. I was like, this is nuts. And all he did was just think it and then visualize it in this kind of installation. And there's another person I'll talk about a bit further down the line when they're talking about what happens when you put something into the public and it's gone too far, or when do you stop, or things like that. He also did a project with Mike Vanis, who I also worked with, which was called Swipe and Shoot. So they built a gun from pretty much something that was put on the web. It's about 8 years ago now. And they actually built kind of basic software where if you had too many hashtags, the gun would fire. And they were highlighting the fact that this technology is now available. And I remember Mike telling me that they got approached by the IRA, is it NRA? The National Rifle Association in America, who loved it and were like, you know, let's take it around the States. And they're like, no, we're saying this is a bad thing. I don't think you're getting the point here. And I think this early kind of making and provocating was something that kind of really, really stood out to me as a way of doing a different type of design. And it all kind of comes back down to Dunn and Ravey, who taught Mike at Design Interactions at RCA. I won't lie, I'm not a huge fan of their work. I love their book. I love the concept. I love what they're thinking. I think their work kind of lives a little bit too much in galleries. It's not accessible enough for me. It kind of feels like this really extreme kind of art world, more than, you know, I think putting it into the public and getting a bit more of a reaction of kind of everyday people, or not just people that are living in this world. But definitely read their book. Some amazing work from them, and their critique of things, I think, is amazing. I guess that was kind of the basics of like me starting to learn what this stuff is. And then it kind of started to get into, all right, well, I actually started doing it.
Mike, do you want to share your screen again? The sound is not picking up.
Is that?
to actually make a house of the future for the topic of aging and dying. We've asked the shaman to collaborate.
Mike, go on mute. Mike, you need to unmute yourself.
Sorry, was that sound not working at all?
You can't mute yourself, otherwise we can't hear the audio.
Okay. I'll just explain it to you anyway. It's probably just easier.
Oh, Michael, when you share your screen, if you just put, there's a little button down the bottom left. It says share screen sound, and then it'll come through your actual computer, rather like it'll actually be the computer sound rather than the mic. Want to give that a go? Yeah, it's in the bottom left. I think it's I think the wording is to look out for is share computer sound.
Yeah, when you yesterday it was anyway. I'll move on for the next one, but because it's we're getting along. But the point of that one was actually the future of death, and so it was the first project I worked on with this team, and it was around what we got to was this idea of reflection, like reflecting on life. And so as you kind of saw, you walked into this room. You didn't know what was going on. You kind of, we timed it perfectly about how weird it was to walk around and stare at yourself in the mirror for a while. And then there was this kind of film, which was like Baraka. I don't know if you've ever seen that Spade animated film of kind of showing things growing and life. And then at the end, you pretty much got re-shown your visual from before. And then it slowly dissipated into kind of bits. And the idea was to get people to reflect on their life and kind of really push that. And the very German client was like, yes, it probably had a very provocative perspective of everything going on. But it was that idea of taking a concept around the future of death and turning it into something that really got me and trying to get a reaction from the audience in that. Another project we did, supposedly Google has some bunkers in the back of Googleplex. They put engineers in there for a month and say, you know, what's the future of something? We got asked what the future of retail was. And pretty much just went to town on anything we could craft in terms of technology, in terms of emotional control, in terms of anything we could pretty much scare them. And this one on the left is actually a mirror that could follow you around the room relative to how you stand and how you sit, and also kind of reflect back yourself and your sizing, but also kind of speak to you in a certain context. Supposedly one of the designers went, can you fucking do that? And we said, give us the money and we'll build it for you. Unfortunately, we didn't get to do that project, but we got to do some other ones. But it was just starting to kind of get into this idea of things. Unfortunately, I didn't get to work on this, but the day that Daljit walked into the studio and said, I pretty much want to create a new version of luxury that connects jewelry to the stars. And I was like, oh, okay, that sounds fantastic. Oh, we could do that. And then one of the guys in the team, the developer, just kind of looked up in the air for a second and goes, yeah, we could do that. And I'm like, we could do that. And within a week, we'd identified a telescope which could zoom in on was pretty much reading the sky of the different stars, but actually had an API where, so, you know, when you kind of buy a star, we pretty much figured out a way to control the lighting pretty much by how much light was being pushed by the star within a week. The biggest problem was trying to get the technology down to a size that was the right kind of mirror, which I think it's launched about 2 years later. But, you know, these ideas of just thinking and then kind of creating was kind of what really got me and blew me away. Then I had to leave and go and make some money because unfortunately working in a studio like that is great, but it doesn't make a huge amount of money. And so I kind of went off and kind of kept my foot in this space. I just kept meeting all these amazing people and just wanted to elevate them. That was a lot about, for me, what Spec Futures London was about, was elevating these amazing people already doing this great work. And so the next bit was just more me being a voyeur and kind of getting into it. One of the speakers we had quite early on is VHM, and I kind of call them the godfathers of speculative design. They've been around for so long that I think if you're a designer in Europe, you're like, oh, did they do that? Like you've seen their work, but you never really knew it was them. And so they were part of a program in Philips design for about 10 years. And so they created what they called the design probe, which was like, how could we probe something in kind of the future? And so the bottom left is actually a program with Philips and Nike, which went on to be probably about 8 or 9 years before Nike Plus came out. So it was in a woman's bra, trying to identify different kind of biometrics within that. The one on the kind of top middle right was actually with Levi's. So it was about how to put technology through the jacket itself, like they've now done with Google. The one on the left, the kind of was pretty much like your emotions through your outfits, was something they actually put out into the public. One of the insights they gave was actually, when a company won't go for this stuff, put it in the public realm and then use that public interest back on the company to make that change, which is something that kind of came out with a few. And the one in the top right was actually a lighting system around mood, which went on to be Hue, which is an actual product now. And the bottom right is a product they did, which was pretty much using waste, like a circular kitchen they made about 15, 16 years ago. And they made a joke about having to try and get a ton of dung from India to utilize as the best dung in the world to be able to kind of formulate the cooking facility. So to actually use that. So by all means, check out their website. They've got so many projects. And actually there's a link there at the bottom of our Medium page. We've just got a bit of an explanation about their work. But yeah, lovely guys, and just done such amazing work in kind of the early days in particular. Another one there in the States, I've only met Nick quickly when I was over there, but the near future robotics. So Nick actually works for Google X as the head of design, and a typical kind of cynical Brit. But what they're really into is design fiction. And what they really like is mundane things. So actually, you probably can't quite read it on the page, but they like catalogs and they like classifieds and really mundane things that you look into. But this pretty much future IKEA catalog they did this is talking about a couch that actually feels your emotions. And understands and starts to change the color and the breakup and, you know, potentially the sound and things that are going on. The one in the bottom left is actually a map for an autonomous car. So the irony of having a physical map for you to understand where your autonomous vehicle is going to go and the detail within that. And as I said, the top right is they also love, you know, like posters around polls and things like that as almost like a guerrilla future. And how to do that. So it's a very interesting way of putting it into the public. I can't find it, but I have a joke about like pretty much the artist version of speculative design, like having to have an androgynous model, having to have something in a petri dish, everything's in white. So they're very much against that kind of art way. And they're very, very much like into the public realm. Worth checking out. All right, let's see if we can make the sound work this time.
Mankind is standing at a crossroads. For the first time in history, the majority of people live in cities. We no longer work in forests or fields. Humans have become disconnected from nature. But perhaps the answer to the problem is right before our eyes. Introducing NaturePod.
Please relax and ensure that your head is fully rested so the electrodes can make contact.
Secure the health and productivity of your workplace now and for the future with NaturePod.
So this is Stuart Candy, who's a bit of a bit of a guru in the situation. He's actually Australian, and he works at Carnegie Mellon in the US. And I think it's probably his humor, his Aussie humor, that kind of bakes into a lot of his projects that I love. So that actually was a joke, Nature Pod, this idea of pretty much, you know, let's not go out into the world, let's go into this moment of nature. And there's a whole joke about being at a workplace conference and trying to sell the product. And I just kind of like his humor and his play on it. But he's very much about this kind of guerrilla futures of crafting and putting these things into public. So he actually had a pandemic one he did about 8 years ago, I think, in Hawaii, around what would happen if a pandemic happened, in terms of all the different elements. So you can see there, if this kind of secondary outbreak, he did it in kind of a small suburb, Chinatown, but just talked about all the elements of you know, what would happen and how would the local council manage it and all these sorts of things. And funnily enough, it rings pretty true to now on a global scale, and it actually made it into the local press. But he's definitely someone who's written a lot on it, especially in academia. He's kind of just got some really interesting models and ways of looking at it if you kind of want to go into it a bit more. And it's good to hear an Aussie at some of these conferences as well, as opposed to just Brits and Americans. So this is a studio called Hassel. It's actually, I think it started in Australia as well, an architecture firm. And actually in the UK, the Design Museum was having a show called Mission to Mars. And NASA had done a competition on, you know, if we moved to Mars, what would it look like? And this is a real learning for me around, as I said, going beyond just, you know, your regular kind of design of products and services, and thinking about, you know, these guys spent so much money on developing like really technical elements of, you know, how do we build this? You probably saw a little bit around, they kind of send these little robots off to help build this whole world before the actual people turn up, and, you know, how does the filtration system works? And so this is all kind of CGI developed as a side project, almost, or as a marketing project for the studio. And then they also kind of had an installation at the Design Museum, which was, you almost kind of went through the house itself. And for me, it just realized that, you know, there's other areas that are already doing this kind of speculative work. They might just not call it that. But it was just a really impressive view of, you know, lots of people that I know and work with who probably work, you know, small budgets and trying to make interesting work. But it was just such the scale of it was just kind of blowing away. But you should check out Hassel is the studio, and they've got a lot more detail on it. I guess from that really high end, you know, really expensive kind of studios, there's some kind of up and comers, which I'm always impressed by. So I think a lot of there's one of the teachers from RCA, Royal College of Art, who taught in design interactions, who's now moved to Glasgow, Art of School and Design. And so there's some young people coming out of there who are really, really interesting. And these guys, Dominica and Lorenzo, started a little studio there called Still Not Quite. And their view is that actually designers are a little bit kind of arrogant, and maybe they shouldn't be doing the work, and maybe they should just be helping the people in those situations do the work for themselves. And so, pardon me, Dominica's actually from a town in Poland, which I think is like the third most polluted city in the world or something. So they went back and did a workshop and tried to teach kind of local people how to create their own products and services, speculative products and services that would help them deal with the everyday smog. So, you know, everything from an anti-smog mask to a robot dog that actually sucks in a lot of the air around your house and kind of runs around in a fun way, and different products. And then what they ended up doing was develop like a fake Amazon site. So you can actually click through on these products, and there's reviews and there's structure and, you know, just a bit of humor and things like that in there. And the thing I really liked about it, once again, is like, how do you get these things into the public? How do you use a format like an Amazon website that kind of makes it start to think, is it a bit real? But at Primer in Madrid last year, the theme was Futures for All, which I always think is a little bit arduous. But they actually got up and were probably one of the only groups, I think them and another, talked about actually handing over the insights and the work to the people that you're doing to, not trying to be the designer and trying to control it. And so their latest project is the Greatest British Cookbook. And it's a play on the fact that what happens if England gets shut down and no food can come into the country, which getting pretty close. And the idea of how do you use like local foods that are available, but also if due to the huge amount of ethnic groups in the country, what are the different foods that are mixing? So, you know, some Indian people up in Birmingham, you know, how are they mixing with kind of local products and stuff up there? So they kind of want to make a cookbook around it, which I think was quite amusing. So yeah, both interesting couple trying to push some work through, and they've just made a couple of fun ideas on Instagram in the last couple of months while they've been working from home. Another guy, Freddie, who I absolutely love, he was in the same class at Glasgow and is a designer now in Berlin. He built a website and a whole thing around a venture capital group he called Venturely. And actually, if you click through and look at the products and services on there, Pygma, I think it is. It's pretty much designer babies. So you can design what your baby would look like, what the personality looks like. And he went down into the depths of, you know, pretty much like, this is the app and this is how it works. And, you know, we're looking for investment. And then one in top right is about machine learning intelligence that can identify when people say things that are fake, so fake news. And it's about stripping back and kind of identifying what the real news is in that. And then the one on the right is a pair of glasses that pretty much gives you the perception and the feeling that you're eating sugary foods and stuff, but you know what, you're eating healthy foods. And he purely did it as a speculative design project. And he was getting phone calls from like Startup Magazine and interviews. And he did a little experiment where on LinkedIn, he shared it with lots of people. And he said everyone down to his family are like, oh, amazing, and lots of high fives. And it was all a bit too positive. So he actually ran a bunch of ads on Facebook of the individual businesses and trying to obviously like drum up money, and got a lot more response of, this is crazy, you can't do this. Even when it was sent to me, someone said, oh, you've got to look at this guy's great. And at first I was like, oh, is this real? Is it? I just love, and he just runs the line very close. Is it real or is it not? Even down to the design of the website and the way it's structured, it just looks like a typical startup. And he's a really smart kid, and he's kind of moved on to some next things as well, which is great. But I think that idea of playing to that startup world and that kind of desirability bias, him and I talked a lot about that, you know, that we're losing that criticality in life, questioning it. You know, it's good to be positive and bring positive things in, but actually, you know, sometimes we need to question some of these things as well. So these guys are the be all and end all, is the easiest way of putting it. Superflux is probably the best design studio in the world that I know of. They have done amazing work. They are a reasonable sized studio, get paid, all those sorts of fun stuff. So the main ones they're known for is the one in the bottom middle is actually, they made some smart implements. So smart spoon, smart walking stick. And the concept was around a family wanting to look after their dad as he's getting a bit older. So making sure he's eating healthy and he's exercising. And the concept kind of makes sense. But the irony is that the unforeseen consequence of people, he starts paying the kid next door $10 to walk around the corner with a stick. And he has this funny visual of him eating kind of nice food on the left with his special spoon, and then kind of eating on the right. And it's this whole idea of us, I guess, trying to manage human behavior in a certain way. But actually, you know, reality is we'll always try and find ways around it. One of the big things they made popular was they did a big piece for the UAE on the future of energy. And I guess all of those sheikhs seemed to think it was going to be really positive and great, and it's all about this. And they pretty much turned around and said in 2050, the pollution that's going to be in the UAE is going to be at such a level it's going to be uncontrollable. And they're like, no, it's not. No, it's not. So the bottom left-hand corner is a little exhibition they created in the museum, where you leant in and you smelt in actually how bad it was. And supposedly it had a big effect on the policy that was driving, as they say in the story. But, just a great way to get that point across. If pollution tends to continue to grow at this point in the next 30 years, this is how bad it's going to be. So Arnab, the founder, has actually done a really good TED Talk. It's about 3 years old now, but definitely look into them. They're fantastic. Their work's great. Some great ones on drones, and a good mix of kind of crafting, putting into the public, and kind of getting that reaction. So that's other people's stuff. I guess I said that's my voyeurism and the things I'm interested in. And there's actually a lot more I had to take out. But just some really ones I think they're definitely worth looking at. And as I said, lots of videos and presentations from the people, and that's there. There's a thing in London called the School of Critical Design. So they started about a year ago, and Jay Paul actually he did design interactions at RCA, and then taught at RCA for a number of years. And he said something to me that's really rung true, which is the problem with universities now is that they're giving you the code and the list of things that you need to do. And one of the reasons when I talk about this sort of stuff, I don't like talking about the process or the steps or the methodology or whatever. And he highlighted the fact that he wants to bring back that studio experimentation. That's what he loved about RCA in the early days. And he wants to bring that back. Like, how do we help each other? How do we bring our different skill sets? We don't need a perfect methodology. It's about, how we craft that together. And that's what they're trying to do with the School of Critical Design. At the moment, it is physical, but we've done a few workshops with them and tried to help them along the way. And they're definitely worth looking up, and whether I think they are starting to develop some online stuff as well, which I think they're really good. Another one is Sami at a studio called Norcap in Finland. And so I worked for a Finnish design studio for a bit, and they're all quite competitive. The irony is that a lot of things like service design and a lot of design methodologies we all use now actually came from Nokia, weirdly enough. And a lot of these designers used to all work at Nokia together. That's why there's so many kind of really strong Scandinavian design studios that have come from that, and we've tend to steal across Europe as well. But they've created a toolkit, which I think it's because I build so many frameworks and toolkits, I kind of get a bit bored of them. But what I found was this is really useful. And so I did it at a workshop in San Francisco, and myself and a Dutch guy in a team of Americans, which kind of didn't go so well. The idea was, how do we help the homeless problem in San Francisco? And so we came up with a concept called Santopia, which if anyone's seen Wild Wild West or read Margaret Atwood's book, in essence, Wild Wild West, there was an idea where they took homeless people off the street and put them in this kind of utopian world. We pretty much crafted that, except it was going to be done by Mark Zuckerberg, because he'd been sent to jail for some sort of data problem, and then he'd come out of jail and built this system. So the Americans didn't really like it very much, because they seemed to like Mark Zuckerberg and thought it was quite negative. But anyway, the Europeans laughed. But I thought it was a kind of a good process to go through, and Sammy's put it all online on that website on the left. So definitely worth going through some of those structures. This is just a fun one we did once, and what it taught me was to think about things in a different perspective. So Ada's got this really interesting concept called Cyborg Shamanism. So Ada's from an ethnic background in the UK and grew up in kind of an interesting perspective around kind of losing her heritage, but kind of modernizing, I guess. And we just did a really interesting workshop around how do you not lose some of those important things in terms of rituals and ethics and elements that you might do in things like your heritage or in religion, but also kind of modernize with technology and keep going forward. And, this idea of we're kind of all cyborgs because I've got a watch on or I've got some sort of technology on me somewhere. So for me, it was just this ability to kind of think in a different context. And one of the great things about running Spec Futures, a chapter, is that you get invited to really weird things like this and meet some really interesting people. So it was just a really cool way that she ended up doing a presentation at the Tate Modern and getting some really interesting input from other people, from both shamans or that kind of spiritual kind of connection versus that kind of, what that future modernity kind of looks like. So just some workshops, and then I'll just kind of finish with something I worked on, which is never quite finished, and something I'm about to do next. So I went into a design studio, and what we decided to do was, after many years, I tried to do lots of speculative design projects. And what I found was that it's very difficult to sell them to clients. All the people I know had pretty much said they made money other ways. And so I think the reason why I left it for a number of years was to go, okay, I've got to find a way of doing it. And so I went and worked at a studio, and when I got there, they'd kind of done some really interesting signal work. So this is all the signals, all these different things that we kind of pulled together and said, well, this maybe what happens if we speculated about this, or this was an extreme in the future. And I was like, cool. Right, let's get down, let's make some stuff. And so we did a bit of a sprint. And what I really learned here was we actually had a really good copywriter. And he was just fantastic. He really taught me a lot working with him generally. But he made a really cool idea, constantly summarized it quite simply, which was, so in essence, what you want us to do is pull back an artifact from the future and then tell a story of how you get there. And so that's kind of what we looked to do. And one of the angles was that we didn't want it to be dystopian. We wanted it to come after a dystopian dip. So something bad happened, and this was the positive thing coming out of it. And so what we kind of looked to do was, how could we just craft different things, what things we're interested around, what we were interested in, technologies, not just technologies. I'm always interested in behaviors as well, not just things like that. But what could we do to kind of create some sort of experience to get a reaction? And we created this concept called your emotion designer. So the idea was that your emotion designer will see you now. And what this came from was people's kind of need for highs, either technical or drugs, or, this kind of emotional highs and lows all the time. So the dystopian dip that they came up with was that depression had been cured by AI. And then now all you need to do is plug in and we're fine. We're going to deal with all these mental health problems. Except the Russians hacked the Ukrainians, and the Ukrainians went into a coma. And then the United Nations had to come in and wake everybody up, was the storyline. And so there was this term that they came up with called being normed. So there was an emotional management agency, I think it was called, that UN set up. And so you had to go through this process of being normed. And so this is just kind of like hilarious at the time, but obviously it kind of made sense to a certain extent. And so we started thinking about what would be a business that we could create that did that. And this was a bit of an ad for the business. So we called it Bliss Tech, and we started to say, okay, what happens? What would that look like? And the idea at the time that we're trying to do for the studio was almost for marketing for the studio, was to set up one of these kind of salons during London Design Week. And so I kind of got the basics of the technology, and we kind of just were too busy at work and couldn't do it in time, and some other things kind of happened. But we kind of written a newspaper article of going there and just kind of used all these different artifacts to help tell the story. I've still got it up my sleeve, and I might do it one day. But it was just great getting the studio behind it and the team around it, and kind of using different tools and ways of doing it, from writing to design to sketching, and a bit of tech is in there as well.
Hey,
so that was, yeah.
I'm very conscious of time. We might need to wrap up very soon.
Last one. So this is the last thing I'm now working on. I'm calling it Regenerates, to play on the term degenerate. But I'm kind of getting really interested in the regenerative economy. And so I met a really interesting woman last year who was kind of interested in a regenerative index of how we start to replenish the earth, but also mixing it up with a bit of Mr. Robot, Fight Club, and a general tension against the system. So the idea is to create a regenerative coin, or regen coin, and start to tell stories in kind of a cartoon fashion. So like a little cartoon each week about what the regenerates are out there doing. So I've just started it with an illustrator and a writer, but just thought it's time to do something. It's been a while, and maybe something a bit more accessible. So that's kind of it. I guess I always try to leave people with stuff to do, without getting too much into like process or whatever, but you're always looking for signals. There's always things out there that's kind of interesting, and thinking about what happens if they kind of get extrapolate, how you dramatize those things. I like running the line of slightly creepy, slightly, is it real? I just think that line is what makes it kind of entertaining and interesting. Don't forget a bit of fun and humor. I think taking these things a bit too seriously sometimes. You want those artifacts to feel real, like people literally sitting there going, is that on the edge? One of the things I think often gets missed is it is about the public response. I'm not a massive fan of it just being in art galleries and stuff. It's like, it needs to be about public response. And one of the things I'm always interested in is experimenting in the way that you do it, how you do it, who you bring in. That's why I quite like methodologies. I think it's a great way to experiment, and has been for me in how I do my every other day stuff as well. And that's just some thoughts on that. And I guess the thing is that the network is growing around the world. As I said, I get people reach out to me all the time. And it's a great time to kind of get involved in that and kind of reach out to different people, especially as a lot of the events now are online and people running it. So don't be afraid to kind of, look out and reach out to different people and kind of share stuff amongst each other. So that's it.
Yay. Thank you, Mike, for sharing. We'll leave time for Q&A, but before I would just like to give a little, we'll come back to Q&A if you guys would like to stop, but I just want to quickly do a quick hit stop for the next event. So Claire Marshall and Mel Rumble, if you want to show yourself. Yeah, they have to go. So our next event coming up is the 13th of October on Tuesday night, similar time. These two wonderful women I have had the pleasure of encountering. They are running a Museum of Futures about the pandemic pivots that's sponsored by the City of Sydney. They are in the middle of collaborating with artists, and they will share with us in October all the amazing projects that's coming through. Feel free to add more stuff.
Hey Tina, thanks. Sorry, I have to go at least because I have to look after the future, as in I have to put 2 little children to bed. But yeah, really looking forward to speaking to you guys next month. It's been amazing hearing what Michael has got to say tonight and going through some of the greatest speculative designers out. We've got kind of a different track on the whole thing where we actually are sourcing ideas from different online communities about what the future could be, and then giving those to artists to kind of translate into speculative design. So hopefully we'll have some stuff to share with you when we chat next month. Mel, do you have anything to add?
Well, I've got Disney on my 5-year-old's kind of my future, my progeny is kind of it's created a soundscape here, so I'm sharing that with you now. It's about to be dinner time here, and I think Claire summed it up beautifully. Thank you, Michael. That was a really fantastic summary of things. It was just incredible. Yeah, I'm really looking forward to giving you an update on what we find, because basically by the time that we talk, we're going to actually have some objects to show you, which is really exciting. So. And on that dramatic note, I'm going to mute myself. I'm sure you're loving this background here.
Great, thank you. All right, we'll move into a little Q&A session. Thank you, Claire and Mel. Anyone here? So thanks, Mike. I for sure have a few things I would love to ask you, but I'll open up the floor. Anyone's got any questions for Mike? Welcome to jump in, or some thoughts about the project you shared.
Yeah. Thanks, Mike. That was awesome. Lots of new stuff that I haven't come across before, which is always great to see. And I'm in that process of trying to gather as many resources as I can for my own research. I guess my question on the note of, you guys are trying to go for that breadth and that increased engagement with speculative design. And from 20 years ago in its origins at RCA, it still hasn't really caught on, which is one of the criticisms of it. So I just wanted to know, what are some of the ways that you guys are working to improve that depth of engagement? I would argue that just being featured on Wired, a lot of this work isn't necessarily productive debate. It's getting a lot of, I guess, angry or happy reactions, but how can we translate this work into something a little bit more productive, where it would, I guess, have a bit more of a result in affecting design work that really gets made? if that makes sense.
Does it need to reflect design work that gets made? That's the question. So
Yeah.
a lot of people, as I said, there's a point of like, I don't think it's about solutionizing. I think it's about, even getting to a point of a solution. I think it's about saying, we're going down a track here. Do we really like it? How does it work? So for example, a number of years ago, actually I lied, when I was doing this, I met a really interesting girl who's doing a PhD in war studies. And so she was she worked at the Pentagon, and she did all sorts of crazy stuff there, which, and she was interested in design at the time and was working in a think tank. And a lot of it was around research and reports. And when I started talking to her about my friend who'd done the swipe left, swipe right gun, she went, what? And I went, yeah. So he'd taken a concept and tried to visualize it or craft it or whatever. And I think what she was interested in was, instead of having these really boring reports, which were so literal and very, certain type of person reading them, how could she take a lot of that problems and challenges that she has in pretty much global geopolitics and start to look at ways that designers could utilize new artifacts to talk about the same sort of thing. And I guess that's the thing I'm really interested in, is that it is storytelling to a certain extent. It's not about solutions. It's about going, what do you think of this? Why do you hate it? Why do you love it? How do we learn from that? And actually, the main point, I think, to hit on there, Sam, is that actually putting it in the public and letting the public tell you is the thing that's come out quite a lot.
Yeah, definitely.
Actually, the public friggin' hate that. Yeah. Or, and I don't think it's always black and white as yes or no. It's about why.
Yeah.
And I think what we've seen is there's a couple of articles around the French government are using sci-fi now to predict the future or something like that. So I think, maybe it doesn't have a big enough name. That's fine. More and more people I see, they're a bit older and gone up the ranks. They're doing it in places that you'd expect. So the Intels, the Googles, it's happening. I think it's kind of like the old, it's a bit of a triangle, right? It's like design thinking is at the bottom. Everybody's supposed to be able to do it, right? Which I'm not 100% sold on, but fine. Everybody understands it now because there's a language around it and people can use it. And I think it's just that maturity level as we go up the ranking. And I think more and more design leaders are getting into more and more senior positions and getting bigger questions asked.
Mm-hmm. Like what I'm interested in is, I guess, and I think like J. Paul calls it like bridging the gap, I think in some article that I read, but it's like you mentioned, the person at the Pentagon wanted to use this as a way of storytelling. And then as a result of that, this storytelling would then affect decisions made by the Pentagon. So in a way, there's still this connection. And so like that's the bit that I'm interested in. So I was just wondering if you had any thoughts around, I guess it might not be solutionism, but a productive outcome of these discussions.
So I'll give you another one. So when I tried to do that emotion designer thing, the whole idea was to get my studio on the telly, right? What my sell to the business was, we're not going to get paid to do this work, but the team love doing it. It's great. And actually, if we get ourselves into the public, we can elevate ourselves and market ourselves in that space. And about a year later, a studio called Method in London did exactly that. And they built what they called pretty much an agricultural box. So they could grow a pineapple in like 6 months, where it usually takes 9 months, because they'd made like a Costa Rican environment or something, right? And they, funnily enough, got on the telly and got great marketing. And I know the MD, and he called me and goes, because he'd just taken over, and he's like, I'm not sure about this sort of stuff. And he's like, Mike, we just got a phone call from the agricultural commerce group of the whole of Europe. And they want us to come and pitch to our group what they should be doing as an organization. And so for him, like, no one in a design firm is thinking about working with the agricultural, group commerce, but they start to see, oh, okay, well, how does that work? And that's what I mean by putting it in the public and then starting those conversations. And I think that, for me, the most senior people, J. Paul gets into interesting conversations, mainly through government, but I think that starts to filtrate, and then we use all the tools that we usually use, co-creation, engaging with different stakeholders. But I do think the public push seems to be the most valuable at the moment.
Yeah. So I guess, but it needs to hit that tipping point of like mass what's the term? The term
I don't know if it does. I don't think it does.
No.
Yeah,
so it doesn't need to hit the TV level, but it still needs to get in front of someone who would then be able to turn it into something else.
Oh, look, I think it could get in the TV, but I think it's the difference between, I still think that there's a skilled level of people out there who can do this. Like, I've worked with designers who could not do it.
Mm-hmm.
They could not extrapolate themselves out of this need, this person has a need and I'm supposed to help with that need. And I think it was our first event or second event. A girl from IDEO got really uncomfortable about the fact that it wasn't human-centered. And she just got really frustrated. And it's like, no, like it's about extrapolating out and thinking what could be a problem in the future or a challenge in the future. But yeah, I mean, I think, as I said, I saw this 8 years ago, thought it was amazing. And I'm seeing more and more of it. The UK government's used it a bit on some projects. There's a group called Nesta, which is like an innovation agency that's publicizing it hugely. There's a really interesting group at Somerset House where Jay Paul has got a lot of relationships actually. So I'm seeing it. And I think, I hate to say it, but I think the Americans will mass push it as well. They've done some interesting stuff in the US with different companies out there.
Yeah, but like when you think of times now when Elon's coming up with these like Neuralink or whatever, and he's already putting it in pigs and stuff, I'm sure if you look 10 years ago, someone would have made some kind of criticism of this, but like where was this debate to prevent us from getting to a stage where Elon's doing this stuff and we can't really do anything about it because it's out there now?
Good word, debate. So I think there's a lot of things going around, particularly in the US, around, you know, well, if we just did more speculative work, we would be able to deal with this pandemic and all this kind of stuff. So I think everyone's going to jump on that gravy train for a while. And I think there's going to be a little bit more of attention about thinking about the future. Like I saw a really good American guy who works in education. I think he's probably in his 60s now, more around just futures, but him talking about future literacy for children as well. So I think that's an interesting way.
Real Miller, I think, from UNESCO. I think that's his thing.
Yeah. So I think you know, there's things going on. It's just, as I said, I've watched it for 8 years, and it's happening, and there's more positive things, and I think it just more things happen, the more kind of momentum gets behind.
Yeah, the ball's definitely rolling. I guess it's just taken 20 years to get here.
Great. Anyone else got any questions for Mike? Just opening up the floor. Or you can also send your questions through. Well, I guess Sam covered some of the things I want to ask. I think the biggest tension in strategic sort of consulting, the sort of more linear work versus, you know, asking bigger questions and having that opportunity to debate. So I guess, Mike, my question to you, for your time in sort of advertising and more experimental places and having sort of the resources and access to work with artists, and how do you see it? I feel that the acceptance is slightly more fresh in the Australian market. How do you, now that you're kind of back in Australia for a little bit, how do you see that playing out in sort of the more linear and strategic design space? Like we know that a lot of Big Four companies and Deloitte are already doing foresight, it's just a different language around it. But I personally would love to have artists and musicians and writers on projects just as a part of it, as an input. What's your view on that?
So I think one thing that will be really interesting with Australia post this is Australia hasn't been in recession for 30 years. And so it's kind of had, I guess, minimum competitive drive. And what you find in countries this size, like Canada, similar, is that they've got such good kind of economies that look after each other. They kind of lose their competitiveness, but it's not as driven as, say, a globalized city. Like in essence, the UK is in a lot of trouble because it is so globally integrated in services that its economy is dying right at the moment. So there's a negative and a positive. So I guess there's a less of a drive in the in Australia to think about what do I have to do next. And I think when you're in the design thinking world or design futures world, it's, you know, oh yeah, we're doing well just as long as we can do that. I think that I've noticed that difference in, as opposed to a ridiculously competitive nature in Europe, and not all European countries, but the kind of Germany's and UK and for sure. So I guess that tension isn't probably there yet. So if the commercial tension's not there, so then it's about kind of getting big projects and big problems. And the government, I think, is way more supportive of things here, it seems to me, in Australia around kind of new problems. And I've been doing a lot in mental health at the moment, and that's a growing problem globally, and I think it's really interesting. So I think there's the tension, I don't think is going to come from commercial in Australia. I just don't think, I think that it's kind of a nice little economy and it does all right for itself. So I don't think it's going to come from there. When you're talking about artists and things like that, I think pretty much most of those works are not being paid for, that I showed. A lot of people are just doing them. And there's nothing better than getting design students, right? Design students are awesome because they're so advanced now. They've got all the tools, and their ability to make and create stuff still blows me away. I really miss the art design shows this year because they were in June, July usually. And oh my God, every time I go to one of those, they still blow my mind. So I think there's an element of doing it and putting it into the public. And I think it's around playing on things that are going to relate to the broader audience. So what are the challenges in Australia? I think, there's a real divide of climate change in Australia where it probably gets hit more than a lot of other countries. But I do think that there's a way that you kind of have to craft your own concepts. And I'm really interested to see what the next event's about, because I think that's a perfect one, which is, what do we do post-pandemic? How do we get, for me, art is about asking big questions, and then it's about that artist's interpretation of that. And so I think being able to do that is interesting. But I think it's also, if you look at the likes at Stuart Candy and the Near Future guys, they're about guerrilla, in real life, stuff that just kind of makes that effect. So that's why I think I'm trying to do another project with a great illustrator in the UK, just to try and put something out that I think is kind of nice and positive and interesting, and just seeing where it goes, to be honest. And none of us are getting paid for it or anything. We're just going to see what happens. Does that answer the question? Or?
Yep, that was a great perspective. Also very conscious of time. Thank you once again for your talk. That was such a wonderful way of getting a grasp of what's happening. It's such a really great collection of interesting projects that you've come across, you worked on. Before we wrap up, anyone else got any comments, feedback, questions before we wrap up? I'm now expecting the longer awkward silence on Zoom. Okay, I'm assuming no. Then in that case, we'll wrap up the event for now. Make sure to look out for our meetups page that you want to sign up for. We'll be posting the Museum Futures Pandemic Pivots event in about a couple of weeks' time. So make sure you sign up, and we've got more exciting events coming up after that as well. So keep your eye out. Summer's coming up, so my motivation's also staying up. Any words that you want to wrap up, Mike?
No, I mean, just get out and do some stuff. Just don't make it, doesn't have to be big, just little things here and there. And also, if you are in a studio, just try and just embed some stuff into your work as you go. Just chuck in that extra speculative slide. I mean, that's what Jay Paul, who Sam highlighted, does with a lot of his work. He goes, well, I could take you to here, but imagine if we took you to here. And you kind of just chip away at clients for a while and kind of show them, oh, what about this and what about that? And I think a lot of the UK studios use little side projects or little things like that to try and get interest from clients. So, maybe go up to the head of your studio and go, we've got a bit of free time at the moment. Why don't we do a little bit of this? I think lots of things like that, just start putting stuff into the public.
And Layer's been doing some really cool stuff. I think they're in the States somewhere. A lot of COVID related speculations.
So I've got a private. So Mike, if someone wants to get in touch with you, what's the best way to connect with you?
I suppose LinkedIn's the easiest for me.
Do you want to stick your LinkedIn in a chat so people can find?
Yeah, where is it? And I also run I've got our LinkedIn in the UK where we share lots of stuff as well. So yeah, I mean, if you want to have a bit of a go through there, we try to share as much stuff as we can. Also, the guys in Milan, so Speculative Futures Milan, their thing is quite amusing. their LinkedIn page, but it's quite good. There's quite a lot of stuff on it. For some reason, I can't do anything but private.
Oh, interesting.
I'll shoot it to you.
Yeah, I'll share it.
Okay. But yeah, so try that. What else is worth checking out? Where do I steal all my stuff from? Everybody always asks me where I get my stuff from, and I always forget. Yeah, we're trying to share. I think we're going to try and get London back up in the next couple of weeks and do some more work. Yeah, I'll send some stuff to Tina and she can share it out, just some different links. And I think the key is to look at a couple of universities. Glasgow is one of them. RCA's kind of lost it now. There's a really weird university in Russia that everybody says is really good as well. So I'll try and just find some people worth following and some names worth going after.
All right. Here I just shared Mike's LinkedIn. Perfect. All right. I'm gonna start recording.